So my question is about emotional suppression. And I have been making like a conscious effort to feel my emotions and to like express them, like either talking them out to myself or journaling. But I'm still finding that if I'm not like sharing those things with someone else, it still feels like there's an element of like I'm still suppressing somewhat. And I wanted to know like why that would be, like if I'm feeling and just keeping those to myself, why is that not enough to stop the suppression?
So great question. Are there are there people in your life that you do feel able to express yourself emotionally with? Or is it a sort of blanket experience that with other people it feels more difficult to express your feelings?
There are definitely people that I can open up to.
Okay. And when you have interactions where perhaps you're feeling something that's strong, but you're not able to express it for whatever reason with that person, does that affect you afterwards? Like, does it leave you with some emotional residue? Does it leave you with symptoms? Or I'm just, yeah, curious as to what the impact of that is.
Yes, like I would definitely say that I would carry that for, I mean, I guess it depends on how long until I could talk it out with somebody. And that would definitely give me some relief. But like I also have a lot of health problems. And so that does like raise my symptoms as
Right.
well if I'm not able to talk it out or express what I need to. And I'm like holding that in.
Totally, that makes sense. And one of the things that I would say is it's definitely a stage in emotional development, let's say, where we haven't been listening to our feelings. And then we start to make contact, we start to feel them more. And there's obviously benefit and there's healing, there's opening that comes from that. But it's almost like a scar or a wound that becomes for a while more delicate and more fragile. So it may be that historically other people not seeing or not hearing or not kind of holding, let's say, your emotions wouldn't have had much of an impact because you weren't in touch with your feelings and emotions. So it's almost like you were in a disconnect, others were in a disconnect, and there wouldn't have been much impact, at least in the obvious sense with that. What then happens is as we get closer to feeling our feelings and emotions and we start to express them, we become for a certain period of time, we become almost intolerant to not being emotionally seen and emotionally heard, because that wound is somehow more open and more exposed, and that part of us that longs to be seen and longs to be held is much more vulnerable and feels much more delicate. And so when we have contact with people where they just miss us emotionally, or we feel there's something we want to express and we can't, it's like it's right there in our immediate experience, and it's tricky. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
that resonates with what you're experiencing.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So the good news is it's a stage.
Okay.
It's like we go from being emotionally disconnected ourselves and with others, and it's having all kinds of impacts on our body and our symptoms. We're just not noticing that in our immediate sort of life, to us being more in touch and really feeling the need to feeling seen and feeling heard, but having this struggle with how do we express. And for some people, they just don't have the capacity, let's say, to meet us in that way. The more that you move through this stage, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, the more you move through this stage, we reach a point where we don't need that same emotional mirroring or holding from others, because there's enough of the healing and resolution in ourselves that it becomes much easier, let's say, to be around certain people that just can't meet us in that place. And I think that the danger can be that if we think the only way to work with it is we have to be seen and heard by everyone, we get stuck, but also we end up sometimes creating more mess around our lives because we have these sort of fractious interactions with people and these arguments and disagreements, and then we just end up more confused in a sense of how to deal with that.
That makes sense.
The trick is the more that you work on allowing and holding and feeling your emotions with yourself, and with these situations where it feels safe and it feels appropriate to express yourself, being able to do that. But the more that you are there for you, the more that healing ultimately happens. Because those parts of you that are longing to be seen and to be held, it's ultimately, as a child, it's the people around us that we need to do that. But one of the gifts of being an adult is we can be that person for ourselves. And it takes time, right? And there's often backlog that we have to work through of all the previous memories that get triggered when we have those various contacts and experiences that might be tricky. How are you doing with being with yourself emotionally? Is that becoming easier as you're getting some more practice and more experience in doing that?
Yeah, like I definitely feel like when I started, it was hard to just allow myself to feel without trying to resolve something right away. Or, if I was feeling something that was very intense, trying to figure out, okay, like, what do I do with this? How do I process it? And just like allowing myself to just sit there and just be like, okay, I'm just going to feel. I'm not going to try to make anything happen. So it's definitely getting easier as I'm practicing.
And that's great. It sounds like you're moving from the more I need to fix it to, as you say, just being with it. And that's tough, right? So like initially, it feels, I think what it feels like for a lot of people is going from having an illusion of control by doing something to fix it to just surrendering. And that can be really hard.
So then, like, when I have been doing that though, and just like, okay, I'm going to let myself feel, what's the next step to actually being able to like digest it and actually get rid of it? Because I don't want to just leave it there either and be like, oh, okay, I'm really angry right now.
Right.
And just be like, oh, well.
So a few things. Firstly, the more that you heal and process the backlog of the stuff that's held in your body and in your nervous system, when you are triggered by someone, you're responding to that moment as opposed to having all of this other stuff that's coming up that you're also having to deal with. So the more emotional healing you do, just the less triggered you become by day-to-day life in the first place. So it just gets easier is the first thing that I would say. I think what also happens is because we're less reactive, we're also able to see situations with more clarity. So when we're caught in the turmoil of our reactivity and our history and all of the struggles that we have with certain people, it can be quite hard to make the right decisions about how much contact or how much proximity we want to have with someone because we're enmeshed in all the history. The more we process that, there might be certain people in our lives that we just go, this is actually really toxic. And this is not good for me to have a lot of proximity with this person. Or in another instance, it might be that through healing and processing a level of the history, we're actually able to be much closer to somebody because we haven't got all of that reactivity that's coming up. So it's not just a case of doing your own emotional healing, but that is a really important piece of it. It's also then being able to see as clearly as possible and make decisions about where you need more boundaries or where it's actually safe to let down some of those boundaries. I'd also say for the vast majority of people, doing this work that you're doing of opening up more to your emotions and processing and healing them, it is almost by definition a sort of bumpy and tumultuous ride, because it's like it's a pendulum that goes from one extreme that swings, and for a while we just need to be a bit more feral and a bit more kind of allow ourselves to have those feelings and emotions come up. So given that sounds like that's some of where you are and what you're working with, sounds like you're right on track, as much as it might feel uncomfortable to be in that place.
Well, it's good to know.
Yeah. Well, I'd be curious as to how you get on with it. I think you're on track. I think you're in the right place. Keep going. It gets harder and it gets easier, is what I would say. It gets harder in some ways as you get closer to some of the heavier underlying stuff. But there's also something about that which is inherently nourishing and satisfying because you really feel that you're doing the work, which I think is some of what's really supporting you through it. And it gets easier because life does also get much simpler as a result. And it's a massive relief for your body and your nervous system to not be carrying the history and having the reactivity.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Nice to see you.
Okay.
Bye.